Now I will discuss sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Flower is the reproductive structure which is found in angiospermic plant. Angiospermic plants is the other name of the flowering plant. Now this flower consists of sepals, petals, stamens and carpels. So a flower is said to be unisexual when it contains either the stamen or the pistil. Whereas when both the stamen and pistils are present, then we call that flower as the bisexual flower. Now this pistil, or we call it as carpel, is the female reproductive structure which consists of a swollen basal part and middle elongated style and the terminal one that is called as the stigma. And this ovary contain ovules and each ovules bears an egg cell. And the next is the stamen. If you look at this figure, you can see the two reproductive part of the flower, that is the stamen and the pistil. Now the stamen is the male reproductive part and it consists of anther and the filament. This anther contains pollen grains. You must have seen some powdery substances when you touch any flower of hibiscus plant. So that powdery substance is nothing but it is the pollen grains of the hibiscus flower. Now this pollen grains fuses with the male gametes, that is the egg cells, and this fusion will lead to the formation of zygote. Ultimately it forms a new plant. So this is the figure of flower. You can see here the first part is the petals. Next there are some tiny leaf-like structure that is called as the sepals. Then there is the pistil, that is the female reproductive part of the flower, and the male reproductive part, that is the stamen. So this is the longitudinal section of the flower. Now for the fertilization process to take place, the pollens from the anthers need to be transferred from the stamen to the stigma. So there comes another process that we call as the pollination. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the flower. And this pollinations are of two types. One is called as the self-pollination and the one is the cross-pollinations. So when the pollen are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, then we call that as self-pollination. Whereas when the pollen from one flower lands on the stigma of another flower, then we call that as cross-pollination. And this transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower is achieved by some agents like wind, water or animals. Now after the pollen lands on a suitable stigma, it has to reach the female germ cells, that is the egg cells, and these egg cells are present inside the ovary. So that process is called as the fertilization. So fertilization we can define like this. It is the process of fusion of male and the female gametes to form a zygote during the sexual reproduction. So this pollination is followed by fertilizations in the plants, and there are certain events which take place in the fertilization process. The first is the pollen grains land on the stigma of the ovary, right? Now after that, the pollen grains forms a pollen tube. This pollen tube grows out of these pollen grains and it travels through the style and it reaches the ovary through the micropyle region. Micropyle region, we already know about this. This is a region in the seed of a plant. Now this pollen tube has two male germ cells. That means they are having two male gametes. And each ovule has two polar nuclei and a female germ cells. Now this pollen tube releases two male germ cells or the two male gametes inside the ovule. One of them going to fuse with the female germ cell, that is the egg cells, and it forms a zygote which grows into the baby plant that we call as the embryo. And the other male germ cell, it fuses with the two polar nuclei and then it will form an endosperm. So what we have come to know that in flowering plants there is a two fusion take place during the fertilization process, where one male gamete fuses with the egg cells and that process is called as the syngamy and it forms zygote, whereas another male gamete, it fuses with the polar nuclei. So since the two fusions are taking place in the flowering plants, we call that as double fertilizations. Now after the fertilization process, there comes the post-fertilization events. So the most important post-fertilization structure is the embryo and seed. Zygote, it forms the embryo and the zygote first form proembryo which later converts into a mature embryo and the seeds are the result of the sexual reproductions, and the ovules get matured into seeds, and ovary it develops into fruits. So what we have come to know after fertilization process, in the post-fertilization events, the zygote it get divided several times and it forms an embryo inside the ovules. And these ovules develops a tough coat and it changes into the seed. And the ovary it grow rapidly and ripen to form a fruit. During this period, petals, sepals, stamens and style and stigma, they all shrivel and fall off. So the advantage of the seed is that it protects the future plant, that is the embryo. And this seed has two parts. You can see in this figure the cotyledons. These cotyledons are the stored food for the future plant. And the embryo has two parts. One is called as the plumule and the next one is radicle. Plumule it develops into shoot, whereas the radicle it develops into root. So this process of development of a seedling from the embryo under appropriate condition is known as the germination process. So students, this is about the sexual reproduction in the flowering plants.